I think, you should, first of all, treat people the way you want to be treated. And regardless of who you're meeting, should try and sort of have high expectations, and I was reading some random biography, I don't know how, of somebody who'd had dinner with the late Queen Mother, and the sort of usual royal protocol, not spoken to unless you're spoken to.
Yeah.
Don't speak, rather, unless you're spoken to. And somebody had the temerity to say, Your Majesty, what do you think are the most important things about being a parent and bringing up children? And, everybody gasped because, the royal order was interrupted in some way. And the Queen Mother sort of said, oh, no, because I think it's manners. And, I'm completely convinced about that. I'm wholly indifferent to the unimpressive nature of the content of someone's CV. That'll put you in a coma in 5 minutes, and parents that so worry about their kids on screens and all of that sort of thing. And I understand why they're worried, and every generation's worried about the one that follows them. But the most important thing I think that will get you through life in every situation is manners. Being worried and concerned that the people around you, or if you've got an appointment with somebody, that they feel comfortable, included, and it's a strange way of putting it, but sort of honoured. There's a famous other story. I keep using the royal families because Meghan in the background. I think it came from the same book I was reading. I was like, about a famous story, Edward VII, who had a foreign potentate of some description who came for dinner, and they served up the finger bowls between the courses, and this particular leader started drinking from the finger bowl. So rather than pointing this out, the king just picked up the finger bowl and did precisely the same thing, which I think is great manners. Anyway, that was a long throat clearing because I just feel awful. So I half an hour late.
Oh no, don't worry. Well, I mean, we're talking about manners as well. I suppose, like, when I've watched, your show on TV and some of the people you get in there, I get a bit shocked by how some of them just behave with their mannerisms and their, not doing themselves any favors from the get-go. I feel sometimes. Does that shock you when people are just kind of that arrogant about it, I suppose?
I'm totally unshockable. I mean, I really think, and I think that's learned. I think you've got a predisposition. I, grew up in a family where there was, it was a loving, unconditionally loving family, which of course is the ultimate privilege, but where people meant what they said and said what they meant, and then practiced, law for close to, well, now for 2 decades, but over a decade of dealing with serious cases, including murder cases, saw a good deal of the evidence in international criminal cases, including genocide. And after a while, you become inured to people's behavior and that sort of thing. Very often, the type of behavior you're talking about are forms of emotional display, and which is a slightly overblown way of describing, people get really angry. And in some of the cases that you're referring to, it'll be the first time that a family member will have seen the other person that's caused them real pain for a really long time. And they may not have the emotional range. They may not be as articulate as you and me, but they're really cross, really angry. And that anger isn't directed at me. It's because every single fibre of their being is triggered by seeing that other person and the pain that they've been caused. And actually, I understand sometimes people perhaps have concerns about my show and have expressed them. They never do when they watch it regularly or come and watch it live, because what I'm trying to do is never to send anybody up. I'm not just mindful, the center of it all is the dignity of all the parties, but to provide the person you're talking about with a chance to be forced to hear the other person, and ultimately for them to hear each other, which is different from listening. And you've got the Lord or whomever, evolution gave us 2 ears and 1 gob for a reason. And it often changes the entire complexion of the conversation. So they might be really angry at the beginning, and by the end of that time together, if they've taken the gift, the chance to hear how upset their actions have made the other person and vice versa, it genuinely has the power to transform that situation. It's never or rarely about the content of the money or the dispute. Of course, that matters. It's about all of the kind of emotional complexion, all of the other issues that money, that breakdown in trust is represented. And that's why they're really angry. And it's true, regardless of your background, who you are. That's what happens. You get really...
Yeah. Do you feel that tension sometimes when you walk in, like between the two people? Can you feel that?
Sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah, but there's never a moment when I shut the door and think, would this be funny for telly?
Yeah.
Lawrence, you remember that I take every case deeply seriously, whether it's a case about a shitting goat.
The dog weddings as well.
A dog wedding. Oh yeah, a Lasso Apso and a Randy Shih Tzu, wasn't it? Yeah. And more about that in a second. But in a day, we'll have 8 cases, let's say. 2 of them might be those, silly ones on the face of it. Although the silly ones can be the most difficult legally, really very difficult. And 6 of them will be exactly as I've described, families in crisis, people who've broken down, years of a challenging relationship, often through a history of personal abuse, often through substance abuse, often in addiction, in all sorts of crisis situations, loss of homes, toxic breakdown involving custody, etc. And you'll only see 10 minutes, perhaps, of a case that lasted an hour, and I have to give full judgment. So there's never a moment when the door slams behind me when I'm doing the Judge Rinder show, that I'm doing the Judge Rinder show. It's a court case. And I care profoundly about that. I think part of the reason I haven't been eviscerated by my colleagues, other than the fact that I did serious work, was fairly well respected before ending up in this odd situation I find myself in on Judge Rinder. I care passionately about the integrity of the law and of the court. And I'm mindful more than anything else, and not just mindful, model the fact that every single person gets treated with dignity. And from time to time, that, of course, might involve me going, oh, you're stupid or something like that. But anybody needs to be aware that I would say the same thing. And I used to say the same thing to my extremely well-paying oligarch clients. Or when I was doing international cases, you don't get treated different by me by virtue of, the size of what's in your wallet. What matters in life is what you do, not who you are. But yes, that's a long answer to you. Of course, you can hear the tension sometimes. And the first job when you get in there is just to remind them, not that they're in court. I never do that. It's a bit you don't see in camera. I do 5 minutes often. It's a shame we're not filming at the moment. I say, look, forget that silly camera over there. And of course, I always speak to the audience myself, talk about dignity. We prepare the audience, I do. And then the first 3, 4, 5 minutes is, this is a chance. And I'll say, what do you want from this? These are the issues of the case. You're here to sue John because he borrowed money from you, the 20-year friendship. It's £3,500. He promised to pay you back and hasn't. During that time, your partner got cancer. You saw that the defendant had gone on holiday 3 times. Knowing what struggles you'd been to, what did that do to you? And we can start there, because it'd be the first time the defendant will have heard the impact of what's happened. And that defendant might also have a valid claim to why he's taken that money. And just that opportunity of being forced to hear one another can have a radical transformative effect. I think it matters.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, your show, I think I feel different emotions when I watch this show. Sometimes I do laugh, sometimes I get upset, sometimes I can get angry. Like I remember watching the one episode where the dad had quite a lot of kids, and there was the son that drew the wonderful art.
Oh, wasn't he wonderful?
I was wonderful, and but that episode made me really angry. Do you kind of like hear about what happens sort of post the show as well?
Sometimes that's such a good. I've never been asked that question, Lawrence. It's a good question. Especially lovely question, because so often at the moment we reflect on. Not so often at the moment. It's a fundamental human nature, and one that's been dialed up because of the nefarious presence of social media. We're so focused on, the negative things people do, and conflict, we forget that every day there are a million, no, more. For every one negative thing somebody does, there are however many thousand people showing up to be frontline NHS workers, etc., etc. Now that's a really long throat clearing to tell you that often in my programs, things like the one you're referring to, the case you're referring to, innumerable people phoned to offer that boy help, and in one case, somebody phoned to offer to pay for his entire arts education. Amazing. And did. Isn't that beautiful?
Yeah, it's beautiful. We don't hear about that though.
Who wants to hear the good news?
Well, that's the thing. Yeah.
Right, and that I mean, yeah, I feel really strongly about. One thing you did refer to, because of that, the dog wedding and stuff, the cases that make you laugh.
Yeah.
And of course, in the morning I get my cases and I think, oh, really. And I hope we'll come on to how the show is produced. It's very, sometimes it's amusing. They might not tell me things,
right?
But I treat every case just as I would if I were dealing with an international war crime, right? The integrity of the law really matters. The documents have to be perfect. There's somebody in my ear, but they're not allowed to say anything that would interfere with the integrity of the judgment. So they can say something's happening. Now, I'll come on in a second, I hope, to talk about some of the silly cases. But the first case I did on Judge Rinder, I'd come from dealing with an international dispute where I was advising the chief legal officer, a bit like the Attorney General of Jersey, and before that, appearing for the government, freezing the assets of the ex-Prime Minister worth billions of pounds. And the first case I dealt with was a wedding photographer who was being sued by a woman. And I said, oh, thank you very much for coming. And thanks especially for bringing your mum. That's my sister. Case number 2, I said one of the most stupid things I'd ever said. I said, oh, this case is worth £80. That's not very much money, say I. And the woman who runs my show, she's a boss. She's from Wolverhampton. And I think she sort of makes, I don't know, Margaret Thatcher seemed like Julie Andrews, type of person I absolutely love. So she very loudly coughs in my ear. Do you want to rephrase that? You sound like a right posh dickhead. That's what she said. And of course she was right. And from there I learned a great deal. And I hope more about that in due course. But some of the dumb cases that you think are so dumb, I'll read and I go, okay, right, it's this. They are eye-wateringly legally difficult. Right. So let me give you an example, or I'll ask you, throw it back to you. Right. Imagine that you're when you could go to, I don't know, anywhere. You're in a railway, one of those horrible railway cafes somewhere that they still vaguely have. They're generic, aren't they? And you're with your friend and you open up a ginger beer bottle. Why you're drinking ginger beer, I don't know, but let's just imagine it.
Yeah, okay.
And you pour out that ginger beer bottle and out of it comes a masticated snail. A masticated snail. Yeah. And your friend has an attack of the vapors. And it's so shocked by this masticated snail that he passes out. Who can he sue?
I mean, you'd think I guess it'd be the people that are in charge of the sort of the products and who putting it out and stuff. No, would it be the railway?
Go on.
Would it be the railway cafe itself?
Yeah, I mean, or what was your first point? I mean, I realize I'm testing you at the same time as trying to get this to work.
Yeah, well, I guess the people, the ginger beer sort of company that product it, no?
Right. So I don't know whether you've got a background in law, but you're absolutely okay. But you're absolutely right. Yeah. But the reason I asked you that question is because that's one of the most important cases of the 20th century. And it's a case called Donahue and Stevenson, and it's law in India, Australia, New Zealand, America, the whole of the common law world. Because before that time, unless you had a contract with somebody, you couldn't sue anyone for product liability, in effect. Mm-hmm. It's not quite product liability. You couldn't sue somebody if they had, it's called a tortious claim. You couldn't sue somebody in tort, i.e., you've done something to me, but I have a contract with you. So what's your responsibility as a manufacturer to me? Now, that's a case about that's a case about a masticated snail that ended up in the House of Lords in the 1930s. And the opening of the judgment from the House of Lords, which is now the Supreme Court, about a masticated snail is, who is my neighbor? And there's a long tome, a philosophical tome about the principle of what obligation do I owe you as a human being if I make something? And that's all started because of two women who opened up a bottle of, ginger beer when this thing came out. And so often, when I meet people, usually I say, like, women in my gym, it's usually the time of day I go, and they sidle up to me and say, "Oh, you're my guilty pleasure." I say to them, "You need a lot more imagination, love." Or the thing I really got, "Oh, some of your cases," or "them people." The "them people" is the most offensive one, and the one that I think is especially ugly. But they're all those cases, and then you go, "Oh, clever clogs. How's about this? What's the answer to this?" And you'll throw out some bonkers case. Like I had a case involving the Piccadilly rats. I'm not sure if you saw it.
No.
It's one of my favorite cases. Please work. Right. I think that we are being invaded by the planet, whomever it is, that's trying to interfere. Do you ever believe that you get up on a Monday morning and somehow the universe is conspiring to interfere with you in some way? It's sort of somehow playing tricks on you, in a way, which is that's what's happening right now. Whilst I'm come on, work. I keep getting this thinking this thing is not supported by. Yes, we're in business, right? No, we're not. Yes, we are. Okay. God's sake. Just about. So, what I'm worried about is it's not gonna charge.
Okay. Yeah, no worries.
Okay, just forgive me.
No, it's not fine. You can edit it all out.
Probably been your most difficult.
No, don't worry.
Well, as long as I wasn't more difficult than Gary Lineker, I'm fine. There you are. No comment.
Well, no, Gary Lineker was Gary Lineker was the other way. He turned up 20 minutes early before I was even ready. I just got.
Oh, don't say that to me. I mean, you're trying to kill me. I mean, that's just.
No, Gary, I got an email saying Gary Lineker is waiting in the Zoom room. I'm like, I'm not going to talk to him for 20 minutes. I'm not even in the Zoom room yet.
Is it good? Yes, we're sorted. Hurrah! Right. So that had a case involving this band. They're a brilliant band. Well, that's not bad. They're a busking group who used to appear outside of Manchester Piccadilly Station. And there's three of them that could really play. And their whole kind of gimmick was that they had these two, sadly now one's passed away, these two, one was an 80-year-old, 82-year-old, one was a 76-year-old street dancer. And they used to dance a bit like Bears from the Happy Mondays to get the crowd in. Anyway, the 72-year-old was a manager and entered the rest of the group in Manchester Battle of the Bands, which is a big old deal for, that part of the world. And they were good. They got to the final. Without telling the manager, the rest of the group conspired that they were going to pull this stunt, was going to tip them over the line. And, this is what was going to get them really seen. They were going to get the 80-year-old to put on a lime green mankini and come out dancing, if they got to the final. Well, as I say, they duly get to the final, only it's dark and the 80-year-old has a wardrobe malfunction. So the bit that's supposed to be covering his manhood ends up on his head and he doesn't have the best eyesight. And of course, he comes out dancing, much to the hilarity of the audience. But of course, they're disqualified for outraging the public decency. They could have got arrested, to be honest. But the 70-year-old street dancer who'd managed the band and got them there lost the opportunity to win his share of £5,000, which would have been £1,000, right? Because they could have won, but for the stunt that these guys pulled. What's the answer to that in law? Now, the case is hilarious, right?
Yeah. And
don't get me wrong, I'm laughing at the video with the blurred bit, a very small blurred bit. But then you ask people, okay, what's What's the
I have
answer
no
in law?
idea with that one. No, that's a tough one. It is a tough one.
It's hard, right?
Yeah.
And my point always is, even when you think that the cases are a bit silly, that the law and deciding what's right can be enormously challenging and interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, there's that one. I mean, you might not be able to tell us, but there's that one case that springs to mind. I always wondered what happened.
Oh yeah.
There was the person that he had throat cancer or something, and there was and he'd owed his friend money or something, and he asked you asked for permission to look at his medical records to see what happened, to get the final sort of solution behind it. But what happened with that case?
I have to tell you, that was some time ago.
Yeah.
You know, I can remember in a day. My brain is a barrister's brain, and it's learned. It's not, you're not born with it. So, you know, I can speed read a novel in an hour sometimes.
Oh, wow.
And in the morning, people say, oh, you've got this marvelous brain. You try sleeping with it. So what will happen is I'll remember all of the facts, and then they disappear, literally sort of out of my ear as quickly as a Eurovision Song Contest song. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
They're just there in order for you to sit with the quiet musical trauma, and then they've gone. So I rarely remember cases, but do you know what? It's as you jog my memory, I do remember that particular person. I do not know what happened after that.
What I can tell you sort of said, you know, will you come back if I invite you back? But nothing sort of, we didn't know what happened really.
I don't know, and I've got to be very careful. But I do believe that depending on that if he did not take the opportunity to come back, which we would have undoubtedly honoured in every conceivable sense and encouraged, that would speak for itself in terms of but I don't remember. But I mean, you know, it's important to take those cases incredibly seriously.
Of course, yeah. I mean, so how did the show sort of start? Because you were sort of writing as well, right? Was this how you sort of pitched the idea?
Sort of randomly. I mean, the answer is, you know, I didn't apply to be on the telly. I mean, not in any way whatsoever. I was doing, you know, sort of, well, I say sort of serious law.
Yeah.
So the potted history of it is, you know, I was at a good set of chambers. One day I cross-examined a police officer in a way which things have changed at the bar, but solicitors then were very influential. You know, when I cut my teeth I started when I was a barrister, working barrister at 21, 22. Too young, for sure. Yeah, but you learn judgment quickly, and often I didn't look like I do now. People would walk past and go, look, I got the child. And I was taught by one of the best in the business, and I would do sometimes 6 or 7 cases a day, having the gift of meeting every single person from every conceivable background. And I got a big break because I cross-examined a police officer, and the solicitor watching was very influential and said, I'm going to start giving you, you know, more and more cases. That's how it worked. The solicitor send the case to the barrister. So very quickly, early on rather, I was doing quite serious work, and then eventually was doing work in Birmingham representing gang members chiefly, and then in some extremely high profile gang cases, only ever defending. And then the long and short of it is I ended up becoming a bit of a specialist in international financial criminal law, which is things like money laundering and how, you know, but defending those cases. And then I ended up being asked to prosecute a case abroad for the Foreign Office, where in the Turks and Caicos Islands. Now, I've got to be careful what I say about that, because 10.5 years later, that case is still ongoing. But where the government was suspended for what at the time was corruption, and the UK, in effect, reimposed direct rule from London. We were going to bring an investigation and a trial of that ex-government. And what they wanted was a bunch of poachers turned gamekeepers, because what I'd been doing for the better part of a decade was knocking cases down. That was my thing. That's your job, not just to do it gratuitously, but to ensure that the prosecution proves its case, but really taking detailed technical points. And so the model that they built in the Turks and Caicos Islands was, let's get a bunch of people that spent their time doing that sort of thing, being thorns in our side, to build the case and see how, and in order to do whatever is possible to secure the integrity of the trial in due course, to lead the investigation from the beginning. And it sounded fabulous, except I had no idea where the Turks and Caicos was. I was at this interview, I'm thinking, what is the Turks and Caicos? The only reason I vaguely remembered it is because when I was little, I used to keep meticulous records of Miss World.
Right.
And, my brother used to connect Panini football stickers,
Oh, yeah. I used to.
Yeah. Well, I did as well, but, people used to keep them in order of teams. I used to collect them in order of attractiveness. I think I had a whole book of Jan Molby's once. He has to page where.
David Ginola.
David Ginola.
Yeah.
No, I was a grown-up by the time he played.
Oh, really? Oh, okay.
Yeah. I never. Do you remember his poor little face when France won the World Cup?
Yes. Yeah.
I've never. God, this is a segue. So I speak for it. I've never understood why. Who was the manager that said that he'd committed a crime when he'd crossed the border? Do you remember he didn't make the French squad because he'd fallen out with the manager?
Trying to think.
Anyway,
no. Yeah. But I don't.
Anyway, I've subsequently met him. He's just as, very unusual. You see, you've got to be very careful when you look at. He's aged incredibly well. Normally, when somebody's that beautiful, that young, I always warn off my girlfriends. Just think about what it's going to look like in 10 years. A bit like a house in France, the roof will fall off, and then you'll be stuck with it. So I didn't know where the Turks and Caicos was, but it was a desert island. And it was fascinating work. But, I'm not one thing, and I hope all of your listeners are, and I hope you aren't either, There are a collection of different ambitions, and, there are people who are specialists and monomaniacal about certain things. But I think most of us enjoy being present in the great buffet of life. And for me, writing and doing other stuff was important to me. And loads of my friends were out of work actors. So I thought, well, I'll try and bring back Crown Court, and I had this idea. And again, part of my innumerable privileges is knowing people in different fields.
Yeah.
So I came back to the UK and did defending in a case in Croydon. And fast forwarding again, I was pretty low. This is the first time I prosecuted in any serious way. And then having come back to defend, I think it's fair to say that I'd lost the capacity, lost the ability to invest the energy, the currency to carry on defending. In order to get up every day and to do that work, you have to believe in the system and believe in the work that you're doing. It's exhausting. All work, whatever it is, depletes you in some way. But it has to have at its core, either because of colleagues or because of the work you're doing, the capacity or the potential, not to be delighted every day, but to regift you the possibility of replenishing whatever capital you've lost. And I was just depleted, just absolutely miserable. And I use the word depressed on purpose because I was, not sad, depressed. And I went to flog randomly this thing with a couple of TV producers who were still friends. And the woman looked at it, and I think she said it was the worst thing she'd ever read. She gave it her sort of aggressively undivided indifference. But I really liked her because she was no bullshit.
Yeah.
And for television, Lawrence, that's
huge, right? Yeah.
Not huge, it's extraordinary.
Yeah.
I've come to discover, in law, my world is good, bad, yes, no, it's done, it's not done. There's nothing more aggravating to me. I don't care if somebody hasn't done something. I care when somebody says it's in the pipeline. Mm-hmm. Well, the answer is no, you haven't done it. And I don't mind, just tell me. And I can't, of course, the world is, that doesn't apply to feelings, which are complex and grey and different shades of colour. But doing things, yes or no. I haven't. Yeah. Or making a decision, yes or no. And if you're not sure, here are my 5 reasons why I'm not sure, but I'll get back to you by Thursday at 10. And 1 minute to 10, which is why obviously where we met and I was a bit late, 1 minute to 10, you have your answer. I mean, in television and in media and in a number of other fields as well, I've come to discover, especially in corporate environments, what I've realized is different when you're at the bar because you're self-employed. So it's unthinkable for you to behave in this way. You know, what happens is that people go to meetings and it's all of this political positioning. So nobody wants to make a decision. What actually happens is people maneuver themselves to take responsibility in the event that things go super well, or the credit, and to divest themselves of any of the accountability in the event that things are a disaster. Which of course, but then it's me. So I walk into this going, so I met this woman who's the opposite of that. She's unusual, eccentric at the time, called Helen Warner, brilliant. And she'd written a bunch of chick lit novels, as she self-describes them. I read all novels. I don't care, you know, what they're, I think anybody's thoughts are interesting as long as they're vaguely literate. Well, I mean, it's one of those things where you may read the brochure, but you're not going on the package holiday, put it that way. I was surprised by a lot of it. And I sent her an email because she delighted me. I like that sort of forthright, direct sort of person.
Yeah.
You know? And she said, it was really lovely to meet you. I hate your idea, but there's a bloke in Manchester called Tom who wants to make an arbitration show. Would you be up for it? And at the time, it coincided with being, as I say, incredibly flat, depressed, and questioning sort of everything. And so I said, sure, went to meet him. And normally from the germ of the idea of a thing to putting someone on telly that's never been on telly before takes years as they focus group you and goodness knows what else. She put it on in 5 months with no pilot in the death slot in August. And I didn't believe any of this was happening, you see. It's just in my, because I'd taken a case in Jersey where I was advising the government on their disclosure obligations in their big independent historical abuse inquiry. And as I say, I then ended up in Jersey as it caught my name on it. I thought, what's going on? Yeah. And then all of a sudden, it captured the public imagination. But a series of random events and luck and the universe conspiring to change things. And I'm always mindful of that. And I don't, listen, it doesn't happen to everybody, but I think about it now in the context of lockdown and context of sometimes when I get emotionally stuck or listening and hearing others. One of the challenges that we face when we feel bleak or dark is the full sense of permanence. It's often true if you've got a health challenge, but in mental health, sometimes just, and I've learned this through my own therapy and reading and thinking about it, is that idea of, okay, I'm really, my anxiety is high, I'm feeling really flat, is having the confidence or the space, very difficult though it can be, not to sit with a catastrophe, but to understand that I'm feeling like this just for now. And there remains present the possibility that life can quite literally change on a dime. And that a year's time, the whole complexion, the whole landscape of the universe and what you're doing, as long as you invest a little bit too, can radically change. And lockdown has kind of gifted us that as a thought too. You know, 13 months ago, blink of a human eye, the idea of permanence, the idea of what our lives look like, how they were curated through the day, totally different. And so often there's that sense where we, if we can sit patiently, I think, with how we feel and think, okay, I'm feeling this just for now, tomorrow. I found that really useful, and that's what happened with the show, and it's been a useful lesson moving forward through life when things have gone wrong or there have been challenges or problems, to think, okay, tomorrow is a new day, and I'm, you know, there's another opportunity around the corner.
Yeah. Do you think about, you know, having that, beating those depressive feelings as well, is about sometimes what you let into your space as well? Because I mean, like the news at the minute, I've had to stop watching the news, especially sort of around the back end of last year, and we kind of had lots of things happen at the same time, and we had not just COVID, but there was the worry that we're going to like leave the EU without a deal. We had like the outrage with the Black Lives Matter protesting and the division there that was caused, and everything was Donald Trump saying what now, all these kind of things happening at the same time. And it was just, even this week, with the awful news about this Sarah Everard, that made me it's made me so sad and so angry. And the news, you kind of got to be careful what we let into our spaces sometimes, because it can affect.
Well, it's more than being careful. We have to be brave enough and courageous enough and active enough to curate the news that we allow in. And it's impossible to help, because what you're talking about is the news, but it's the bad news.
Yeah.
Isn't it a fascinating feature of, I'm increasingly convinced, human nature, that I could tell you, Lawrence, 9 good things about you and say, well, but at the same time, I'm not entirely sure about that zipped up hoodie.
Yeah.
And you'd walk away tomorrow going, oh, he said I was intelligent and listened very well and all that. But that's what you'd remember.
Yeah.
And that we are almost predisposed to absorb the negative and the dark, and how easily or how much more permeable we are to darkness than light, despite it being everywhere around us, and of course we have to know what's going on, but how much of the news that you're referring to, in the same day, of every single item on the news that you're referring to, the horror of the beginning of the pandemic, there were responses all around the world, and people attending every day, thousands, to react bravely and courageously, to show up on the front line regardless. In the horrendous situation that we saw on the weekend, and the murder that you're referring to, I have this gift of being able to go and listen and speak to young officers. The number of brave young women officers as well, of women officers, young officers, especially from different communities, women of color that are now joining the police force in order to change the police force. I mean, how dynamic and thoughtful they are. There are good news stories everywhere. I think about some of the work I've done on the Holocaust, for example, and I go to speak to the Holocaust Education Trust. There are Holocaust ambassadors from every community, from Muslim communities, from communities beyond the reaches of the Jewish community, in places like Tyneside, where individuals have taken personal responsibility to go out and tell the stories of the Shoah, the Holocaust, and become personal witnesses. Good news stories everywhere. It's about what we choose to bring into our world, but it's freaking hard. I got COVID in March.
Oh wow!
Yeah, last March. And sorry if I'm banging on, by the way. Do tell me to shut up.
No. It's interesting.
I got this really good gig, right? Which was I got the chance last year to go to Namibia with Comic Relief. It was amazing. And I don't think I've talked about it in any real detail, but seeing as, I was late, I'll tell you. Well, at the last minute, it was moved from Mongolia because it was the beginning of the lockdown. And they were worried that China, which borders Mongolia, as you know, was going to shut the country down. And the organizers moved it to Namibia, and it was going to be a across the desert race. I don't read the small print because I'm just thrilled to do anything. And as a so-called person of the public eye, you get such disproportionate praise and privilege for doing bugger all. I'm like, just pleased to show up. Tell me what you want, and I'm there. The only thing that troubled me a bit on this one was that I'm sometimes conscripted or cast into events a little bit. I'm not saying it's true in this case, but you can see it from time to time with people with what you might describe as a kind of low-level homophobia, or rather that expectation that it's a fitness event, let's get Rob Rinder in because he's going to yelp like a highly strung poodle or be John Inman on steroids. Do you know what I mean? And of course, not only am I fit, but you know, I've run several.
Done a marathon, haven't you?
Well, but I mean, a 2:55 marathon, and you know, fitness is absolutely the kind of integral feature of how, not just my life, but the way in which I curate or manage my mental health is very important. But of course, also what matters to me is nobody externally gets to determine my narrative or who I am, right? So when they put me in the ice bath, waiting, as I say, for me to yelp like a highly strung poodle, you can see it. So I sort of asked for a cigarette and a glass of wine because screw you.
Yeah.
You know, how dare you come with predetermined, preloaded expectations of who I am based upon your flawed perception of who I am without knowing me. It's a good lesson for how we meet everybody, right?
Yeah, right.
And again, part of the way in which we talk about those subconscious biases that we have with people, which are true and real. Anyway, so running across Namibia, I thought, great. And it was one of the greatest gifts of my life. And I didn't realize it would be. On day 2, I was running very fast. And to be fair, the other, apart from Louise Minchin, who's a badass triathlete, I mean, she's just extraordinary, her mind, but she got injured on day 2. So I was out on my own, and there was a moment in the day, which I've never had before or after, and I feel sure I won't achieve again. You know, people talk about being in the moment.
Yeah.
And often that's the type of thing where I often feel it's inauthentic, or somehow they've sort of read some 5th-rate self-help book and they've imagined what that is. And, you know, it's the eye roll to end all eye rolls and the shoulder shrug to end all shoulder shrugs. And all right, love. Until you experience it. So I'm running across this desert, and it's sort of biblical, insofar as there's nothing to look at because it's so vast, but one color and 40 degrees, that you end up going inward. And I wasn't thinking about what was happening in front of me or behind me. I was just consciously thinking of the breath and being present. And it helped. I had 9 Mahler symphonies, a bunch of Dolly Parton, and some One Direction. And the Out of Africa theme tune came on. You know, it's John Barry, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I just burst into tears. It was floods of tears. And I can't explain it, but it was something about just being present. And anybody that will know me knows I don't cry easily, ever. And I'm not ashamed of that. It's just difficult to be connected in that way for me. It was so moving, and it was beautiful. And I came back, and I think about 11 of us went or something, and 9 of us got COVID. And I was sitting on my sofa, and you've got to bear in mind that exactly as you're describing, nobody really knew what this was. People thought that it was a kind of almost Daniel Defoe plague. Daniel Defoe was a diarist, not diarist, excuse me. He wrote about the Great Plague in 1665. And all I could see, and I had the news on all day, were satellite pictures of pyres in Iran and Italy. And I could feel, as this news was coming in, my anxiety level going up. But not just going up, it absolutely interfering with my health. Is the simplest way of putting it. So I had pretty ugly symptoms in week 2, not hospitalized, but some of that, I feel sure now, looking back at it, having been through it, was connected to the way in which this news was interfering or affecting my emotional response.
Yeah.
You know, when you're in a heightened state of anxiety, it undoubtedly interferes with your capacity, not just to have good mental health, it interferes with every facet of your response. And so, like you, I just stopped, I just turned off the news. Because what's the point?
Yeah. Well, they talk about stress as well. Stress just being so damaging to your health. Like, I don't think we sort of know how some people don't realize how much stress can affect us. It causes so many health issues.
We do. I mean, I've seen it in work, and we know, I mean, there are some good studies. I take the trouble. I mean, not only am I not a know-all, I love being present around people that know everything. I'll sit and listen to people talking with authentic enthusiasm about broccoli. I mean, literally, if they love it, and it's like so interesting when somebody's delighted about something. Yeah. But it's interesting you talk about stress and physical health, and there's lots of studies on this now, and how it affects every facet of how we respond, both in terms of our mental and physical health. And there's undoubtedly an effect and reaction. Of course there is. Yeah. For sure.
Yeah,
it's how we mitigate it or how we cope with it that matters.
Yeah, and one of the most fascinating programs I've watched recently was it the program Who Do You Think You Are, and sort of looking at the Holocaust past of your family and your granddad in particular. And there's that lovely it choked me up a bit when you met her. Was it your granddad's friend Ben?
That's right.
That really choked me. What was that whole experience like for you? Just visiting those sites, I suppose.
Yeah, it's a complicated one. It was a huge privilege. As you know, I went on to make 2 more documentaries, The Holocaust, My Family and Me. And this is a kind of big conversation. Being the grandchild of a Holocaust survivor who I knew, I grew up with 2 of my grandparents are still alive in the late 90s. That their legacy, their presence, their being was sort of inescapable. And so, you talk about stress and endurance and all of that sort of thing. When you've been alongside and somebody's been so critical in your life, who's touched the face of tyranny, been there, been a slave, stood in the cold, known of the trauma of their 2 parents and 4 sisters and a brother being murdered, that ultimately is the thread that informs your tapestry in some way, right? And it was amazing, standing on that ground. And I know Sir Ben, I forgot he's called, your listeners get a chance to listen to his Desert Island Discs. It's worth it. He's an extraordinary person. Like all of the other survivors, and I mean everyone I've ever met, they don't hold on to a single iota of hate or of a thirst for revenge. And when you're around them, it's like this sort of collection of joy. It's a Jewish word, simcha. So in Jewish tradition, you're supposed to, let's say somebody dies, you're supposed to mourn for 12 months, unless you've already booked a party. And the reason for that is because there's so few opportunities for joy that you've got to delight in every moment of it. And that's what they're like as this family. And Ben is that person. And standing on that ground, a number of things happen. First of all, what you can't see, and it really mattered, was I was freezing. And there I am on that ground thinking my grandfather was there wearing nothing but rags in -5, I think it was. And just the type of cold that gets to your bones that you'd give and pay anything to make it stop. Day after day, week after week, month after month. What did that mean in terms of survival? Did it mean to feel and experience that? Just to have that sensory experience. The other thing about it is, again, it's a big topic, but there are lots of sites like this, these dark shadows dotted about the whole of Europe. People know Auschwitz, it's a curated museum, and they've heard of it, and often they interchange Auschwitz and the Holocaust. There are hundreds of these places on the ground, on our earth. And what's amazing is that as we stood on that ground where my grandfather was a slave, there was just a jagged suggestion of what was there, little bits of concrete. But of course, like a Gaiic force, that's nature responding. It's been blanketed over by forest, as if nature has hidden what took place. And that moment that you saw with Sir Ben, when he touched my face, the profundity of it wasn't standing on that earth, although that was a gift to be sure. It's also when he held my hand and said, okay, let's walk out together. And you just imagine 75 years before that he was able to hold my hand and we were able to walk out of that place together. Yeah. It's an extraordinary thing to have done. When you're making a program like that, you're of course mindful. It's really unwet. Like, I always sort of struggle to describe it in a way which doesn't feel pretentious or twatty, but that's, you know, an enduring problem in my life. Mm-hmm. The kind of macro story, what I mean by that is the big historical story you want to share and include with everyone. It's a critical historical event. How can we make everybody feel included in that story? And that, of course, I'm mindful of. But at the same time, there's a very micro, there's a very personal complexion going on. Yeah. So as I'm discovering more and more about my grandfather's life, you know, where I knew the outlines, the dark outlines, but not the color.
Yeah, I was going to say, was he able to talk about it much, your grandfather?
It never comes out in one story. Nobody sits down who's a survivor and says, one day this happened. Mm-hmm. It could be in behaviors. So when he died, albeit in some relative comfort, dotted about the place were little handkerchiefs with food at backs of cupboards, etc. Think about that when you, next time you say, I think I'm hungry. What does it mean to know what hunger is? Well, there's your evidence. Certain stories that he would tell about not pushing yourself forward because, about openness, he'd connect them in some way. My grandfather's best friend was a man called Murphy, who was a 6'3" guy who I think he was originally from Jamaica. It's amazing. Guy, and my grandma used to call them Ichel and Michel. My grandfather was 5'3", and they used to sort of go everywhere together. My grandfather used to, I mean, a proper eccentric. We'd go on holiday, take me and my brother, just the two of us, and he'd get bored during the day, so we'd be in some terrible place in Bournemouth, and he'd go and get a job in a Greggs, or he'd go and visit a mosque for the afternoon. I mean, really. But I tell you that story because he had this sort of enduring open-mindedness. And I don't mean that virtue-y open-mindedness, not the type of stuff you have to say, I'm open-minded, or I'm not. When people say those sorts of things, people tell you they're probably not. Yeah. Do you know what I mean?
I know what you mean.
So when people tell you they're charitable, you know, actually the people who are really charitable don't tell you that. You know what I mean? So yeah, he never told you the story in that sort of linear narrative, just little bits of the puzzle, if you like. And to that extent, what a gift it was to hear various things. So in the Who Do You Think You Are you're talking about, it turned out, as you know, the historian that was showing me around this building, his grandfather and my grandfather had been best friends, and I had no idea. But this building spoke. Mm-hmm. You know, I've been teaching in lockdown primary school kids, 9 to 11, Tudor history, which I'm really interested in, right? And I love the best way to do it, really, if you get a chance, go with the parents, go with the kids to the Tower of London. And what you can get them really excited by is this idea that if you're standing in the Tower of London, you can just squint enough and look at a brick and crowd out the noise of the flight path on the way to, you know, Heathrow, of the planes going over. That brick was precisely the same color, same texture as a brick that, let's say, Anne Boleyn looked at on her way to the scaffold. Mm-hmm. So to that extent, this object has this imprint of human memory that we share. And you can look and touch at things, and they're like little time machines, right? And in the case of this building that had all the original wood and all of these lung butter yellow lights that were exactly as they were when my grandfather had played, I was fascinated by it. Then this guy sat down, and his grandfather had kept a periodical about life in that place. And I knew nothing about my grandfather's family. So he would have one sentence, or he might read out one sentence. Eli Melech, that's my grandfather's father, was small in stature but high in hopes, darting about the place. Before that moment, I knew nothing but a name. And every word, every verb, darting about, small in stature, was like a universe of life. It was like breathing life, soul back into this person that was otherwise a statistic, you know, nothing more. And that was an amazing gift to bring back to my family. About 20 years before, they say on the program, I had gone back with my grandfather when he was alive. And it was just at the moment where, in fact, the factory where he'd been enslaved was still operating, interestingly. And there was this amazing moment, which is one of the real seminal moments of my life, although I was not old enough, I think, at the time to appreciate it. So I retrospectively, I think, experienced it, you know, as we often do when we rethink about stuff that happens through a more mature prism, we went back, and this building was in the beginning or middling stages of a decay. And we walked up the stairs, and he looked through the window and said, "Oh, that's the wallpaper I had." And as we were coming down, there was this woman there. And I was there with my mum and my brother, and she looked at him and he touched her on the shoulder. I don't think they spoke. It was a moment of human connection that lasted, I don't know, maybe less than a minute. And they walked off. And it turned out that that woman was the daughter of the only non-Jewish family in that building full of people. And she had no idea that he'd survived. And there he was, standing there with his grandsons and his daughter. And in that moment of connection, it was almost where kind of prose ends and poetry begins. There's a moment of human connection. It doesn't matter whether you're a person of faith, it doesn't matter whatever your background is, it's where the divine is, that sense of something beyond the physical, where they said everything and nothing. There was too much to say. So she looked at him and he touched her. And in that, I don't know, 30 seconds, they'd said everything. And I reflect on that a lot, actually.
Yeah, no, I can imagine. And it is baffling. You get people that are the Holocaust deniers, and and I only bring it up because it does make me angry. And I don't know if it's because if it's like a lack of education thing, and it's always the same people that have conspiracies about most things, in general. But this isn't, was there another shooter on the grassy knoll, JFK? This is something that affected millions of people. I mean, have you ever had that conversation with someone that's been a Holocaust denier?
So I've been lucky, right? Let's start with the good news, seeing as we're on that topic, Lawrence.
Yeah.
So that who do you think you are, right? Mm-hmm. I was by far, in fact, I'm looking to my right because I've got the TV guide of all the other people that were doing that series. I was by far and away the least famous, well-known person. And yet more than something like 2 million people more watch my episode. They weren't watching it for me, that's for sure. Not a peep of anti-Semitism on social media. The subsequent 2 documentaries, The Holocaust of My Family, meet over 7 million people. Hardly any anti-Semitism or Holocaust denial on social media at all. And the BBC take that stuff seriously, right? Mm-hmm. It's a thirst to know, to share, to witness, to want to be good. So let's be clear, although there is the shadow that you're talking about, not only is it small, but for every one person that is infected by the darkness of the conspiracy theories that you're talking about, there are 100 that have the courage to stand up against it. So let's not disproportionately give them the presence, the credit, and the voice. Mm-hmm. That's the bad news story. It's very important to remember that. Mm-hmm. But you see, I never get angry because my grandfather never got angry. There's no point. Anger doesn't help. One of the things that does alarm me, however, and there are amazing organizations like Holocaust Education Trust and various people that are working to combat Holocaust denial, is that it's now become part, Holocaust denial, Holocaust equivalency, and all of those sorts of things. It's moved beyond the realms of, well, let's put it this way, people that hold those views or held those views very often can't be changed because it doesn't sit in the logical cortex of their brain. And that's increasingly true of how people interact with each other. In other words, you and I might passionately disagree about an issue. We could have an argument and I would deploy some facts and you'd have your arguments, which would include your point, your example, and your conclusion, and we'd agree to disagree and we'd walk off and perhaps have a drink. Yeah. And that was, I think, very often how people would interact with each other. When you're talking about conspiracy theory, and when you're talking about Holocaust denial, and increasingly other issues too, that doesn't sit in the logical cortex of the brain anymore. It's governed, I'm more sure than ever, in the part of the mind where the emotion is governed, and consequently where identity sits. And so you're not really having a discussion. It doesn't matter what facts I tell you. You've got, as some people dangerously describe, counterfacts, and they're widely available. And what's more, if I attack your point of view with logical argument, however true those facts are, whatever evidence I deploy at you, I say deploy, what I share with you, it doesn't land. I'm attacking your identity. In which case, I'm not listening anymore. And that, of course, has been dialed up in the most frightening and, I think, corrosive way by social media. But there are two elements and two ways of responding to that. The first is a positive one. I used to work doing big old cases, right? And I used to bring cases down by alleging conspiracy, right? The police are all at it, blah, blah, blah. And without going into it too much, over the years, I ended up advising in big old cases and stuff. And when you're at the other side of the table and you realize, I'm taking it out of the Holocaust example now, that there are no conspiracies. It's just a bunch of people doing their very best. And from time to time, you know, you get people that collude and they've probably broken the law, and I don't excuse that, but it's mostly cock up, not conspiracy. Boy, is that a frightening thing. Boy, is it frightening to be in the room as the lawyer when somebody's asking a very important question and you're looking around behind you thinking, well, asking me is a very serious question. And it's a moment of becoming an adult. But it's a very frightening one. People would much rather believe that there were organized elites governing the world, rather than having to surrender to the terror of it just being a chaotic series of events led by people who are sort of muddling through and doing their best, regardless of their political complexion. Of course, it's actually, there's a comfort in believing there's a shadowy elite, you know, and yes, there are elites and there are people that do things which are bad, and yes, there are some conspiracies, but it makes sense to me why you'd want to have that thirst to believe.
Yeah, it's like with everything, isn't it? It's like whether it be, you know, the Holocaust, COVID, 9/11, it's like something so terrible. It's like there must be more to it.
Precisely. But the other thing is how we engage and how we respond. And this is the second point, which is really important. That's why I felt very strongly about the documentary I made, the second one, Holocaust, My Family, Me, and the work that I'm hopefully going to go on to do around the Middle East and a lot of the issues you're talking about, which is to say, look, I'm not going to change your mind. It's held in your identity. You believe this. And now what's more, you can find 50 shades of different evidence your counterfact, so to speak. So what I'm going to do is honor you enough as a human being to meet you with goodwill, no matter how wicked I believe your view to be, how wrong, how damaged, how dangerous even. And say, firstly, that I'm going to honor you enough by saying, I hear you. I think that matters. I think it matters to another person to say, you've been hurt, because that's important to them. It's important in a conversation. And then to say, in a large throat clearing, look, here are the facts. So at least you've got them out. And then to say, I'd just like to share a story with you. And often that can be the most powerful agent of change. So in the case of the Holocaust, what HET does, the work that I make and other people, and there are so many heroes out there, I'm not included amongst them, is to just tell the story and walk off. I'd like to tell you the story of Marianne Cohen, 21-year-old who went and rescued Jews, and this is what she did, and this is what she saw. And here's her diary, and here's a photograph. And what a courageous person she was. Because I believe, you know, that most people confronted by a moral choice of real significance want to cast themselves on the right side of history. They want to believe that they'd be heroic and courageous. People want to be that person. Mm-hmm. And if you can tell them stories that force them to elevate themselves to that person, they're more likely to act with courage and truth. So I think as we're advocating against conspiracy theory, against Holocaust denial, it really matters to tell the stories. It matters not to shout. It matters not to come to that person that's arrived in that dark place with angry judgment, because it doesn't help, it doesn't change. In fact, it's likely to make the person more entrenched, because the fact that you've got angry is yet another example in an addled mind of proof of why you're yet more part of that conspiracy. See, that's an aggressive response. He's trying to hide something. So I think one of the things we need to get better at is becoming more, not just knowing more, but becoming more emotionally articulate in how to be effective advocates. And I feel sure that part of that is hearing, deploying facts, and then saying, let me tell you this story. Like I say, moving it out of the Holocaust space, you know, I used to represent, because you don't have a choice, I emphasize, and I hope I would only tell this story, and it's important you include this in your podcast, as a barrister. It's called the cab rank rule. It is absolutely a fundamental ethical principle. You do not get a right to turn down a case on the basis of your political point of view, which meant that from time to time, I'm gay and Jewish, and I had to represent the National Front from time to time, or members of it, in criminal cases. And one of them said to me something sort of homophobic or something. And here's the thing, the reason I laugh is because, you know, Lawrence, I never met somebody ever, I still haven't in life, not one person. And this is after years of really being in the trenches of criminal work, as I say, representing people whose currency is invested in hate, that was a happy human being. You know, so this poor family, and I say poor family, imagine having residual energy at the end of the day. It's hard enough, the things people have to do, to write something ugly on Twitter or on whatever the other one's called. I don't go on it.
Instagram.
Yeah, just imagine what sort of person you would have to be to do that. Mm-hmm. You know, these were not happy human beings. You've got to always remember that the people that are joyous and full of delight and have good things going on in their world are not people who are espousing hate and conspiracy theory. It's a type of thing that will gnaw at you. And that's what the survivors teach you as well. And so by the time I ended up in the public eye, look, you know, whatever anybody said about me, unless it was a family member or a loved one whose opinion mattered, I value. I was like, well, you know, I know you. You're up all night wearing a moo chain smoking parliaments. It doesn't land, in other words, because, you know, what must your life be for you to be addled by hate in that way? How tragic and sad. And sadly, social media has really dialed that up. Also, the other thing that it's done, very frighteningly, I think, especially on Twitter and in other places, is that, you know, most people don't care about social media. They're not on it all day. Overwhelmingly, they're not on it. But there is a disproportionate power that individuals have to affect, sometimes even curate, certainly influence the corporate and political response. You know, you think, this is crazy. This is a tiny group of people.
Yeah.
And I think that's a huge problem. And, you know, politicians and corporate environments are guilty of that, and it's a problem.
Yeah, well, so social media is a huge problem, isn't it? I mean, obviously
Right.
Donald Trump's been taken off it now, but like people, I guess his supporters would say, well, why are they taking him off? You know, they hiding something, but all that hate that he kind of spouts on Twitter, it all filters through. And if the president of the United States can say these things, it lets his supporters think it's acceptable to talk like that and have these views.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's gross, but there's no but, there's an and. There's an and, you know. I am really worried about how, exactly what we were talking about, right, before. What it's done, and I think this is the most nefarious thing it's done, is it's made it less able for individuals to hear, and I keep using that word on purpose, hear the views, lived experiences of people beyond the borders of their own experience. And that's a huge problem. And it's also given platform for people who are the most shouty, like Trump, to be sure. But what it's also done is it's created, or it's siloed people into their own political echo chambers. And so for me, there are many tragedies of it, but where whatever leadership or whatever political complexion is using language in that way, it makes it less possible for people to really try to find ways of having shared and common experience. Sorry, for them to listen and hear their common experience. And that's important to me because at the moment, you know, most of the work I've been doing in lockdown is talking about, well, access to justice. And bear with, sorry. What really troubles me is that our country, it's true in other places too, is becoming less socially mobile than it ever has been. You know, I may sound like this, like I'd be mugged by a Mitford, but actually I grew up in a working class community. My dad's a taxi driver, my mum's a businesswoman who achieved extraordinary success, right? I got into chambers and blah, blah, blah. Those worlds, access to justice, for example, social mobility, I think has never been worse and is becoming even more challenged. Your capacity to get access to a lawyer if your kid, for example, has special educational needs, if you've got a housing problem, etc. All of that is determinate. All of that can be affected by your ability not just to have sharp elbows, but to have network to a lawyer, to the financial capacity to pay that lawyer, to not be affected by authority, to be listened to and to be heard. Right? That's part of this underlying story that will, I suspect, intuitively come out in Grenfell too. You know, the communities of the ignored, right? And one of my one of the things I'm troubled by is that experience, that lived experience where you are removed at arm's length from power, from being heard. There are shared experiences, shared class experiences in Tyneside and in various communities, for example, in Lambeth. And I listen and I read those, their legal problems. So I think, gosh, you've got so much in common. And what I worry about in social media is that the poorest, those who have so much similar in terms of their lived experience of not having access to power, not having access to justice, so much similarity, and yet all of these mega powerful elites are pitting them against each other. And actually, those are the communities that should be working together to be teaching us to be the lived example of how we are failing. And social media is making that far, far worse.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I mean, even seeing with Meghan Markle, that interview, did you watch the interview of her and Harry and Oprah?
I did.
Comments you had to deal with. Yeah.
Well, it was an interesting one. My editor at the Standard asked if I would stay up all night on Sunday and do the leader piece. I do a column in the Standard, and I said absolutely not, because I don't know them. It's just not my style.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know these people, but there is one thing I want people. I don't know Meghan Markle. I try to judge people based on having met them. Now, I haven't met Prince Harry either. I care deeply that he served his country. That matters.
Yeah.
And I think it matters in a way that can never, ever be ignored. And we owe a debt of gratitude to, can see a picture behind me, a court case.
Yes.
And that's me representing a British soldier in a case where he was accused of a crime in the course of the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And I knew nothing about the army before then. It matters to me he gave service, right? So for that point alone, I thought he's a good guy, put it that way. That's a starting point. So I wrote something very, very silly, which is this, which because it's a jokey column, right? People can, I think they've taken that, which was, I said, well, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to sit up all night. Absolutely no way. But I'll look at the clips and I'll write what I like about the Sussexes. And what I liked about them, I said, well, I like the fact that her views may not be your artisanal cup of tea. Yeah. But I love it when a husband who's otherwise probably a bit one-dimensional and about tanks and rugby and that sort of thing, type of person I'd sit next to and go, oh, God, And then you meet the wife who's got all of this fun things to say. I love it when somebody marries someone fabulous. And I used the word brainwashing, and I said, and isn't it fabulous? And then point 2 of the column was, that he was well endowed because he was ginger. And that was the column, and it was a silly column, of course. But I think I said something about Greg Rutherford, who's a friend, having a ginger stem dingle dongle, which is a bit like the hammer throw, and that's what gave him his extra inches in the long jump. It was stupid and silly, right? And the next morning, my editors called and said, "Look, you have to rewrite this piece because." Obviously, nobody was aware of the extent of just what Meghan was going to disclose. And at first, my response was kind of cross, and it was cross because I think sometimes we stop. There's an element of who can be the most outraged and the most serious. And whenever I think about that, about not being able to laugh at stuff, I'm reminded of one of the last interviews that the hero of mine, Maya Angelou, gave to Anderson Cooper on CNN. It's so worth watching. It's just so beautiful. I watch it a lot. It's one of my happy places. And she's asked a question about the people she knew in her life, from Malcolm X to Martin Luther King. And she's asked, it's a really good interview. She said, oh, yes, we used to cry together, but we used to laugh together as well. And I don't trust anybody that's serious. Like you've got glue on the back of your hand and you say, I'm serious. That you need to kind of find the delight and the joy in stuff. And I worry that in general now, there's this terror around going, and yet the same conversations are taking place in private. I couldn't give my more undivided indifference. May they be happy and joyous. They look like a gorgeous couple that I'd have a great old night with. But isn't it funny that he's ginger and hot? And isn't it amusing that he's now got some interesting views? Well, instead, I had to write a new piece because there was such a terror that what I'd written was somehow going to be ill-received. And I thought, to be fair, and I must insist you keep this in, it's important. Yeah. Once I had appreciated, again, I didn't watch it, once I'd appreciated what she had said, I did think it was important to write something serious. So I did the next day. And I've no comment or value judgment at all about what she had to say or the interview or the quality of it. But one thing that really did strike a chord with me, and the piece that I ended up writing, and I haven't spoken about it a lot, but I've written quite a lot about it, was that there is a massive gender issue, and it's something we're thinking about this week. And I've been mindful of this for years, not just because I was brought up by a single mom, but weirdly, something that happened on Strictly, which was a real epiphany for me. I've been led by the best women lawyers of their generation. I've worked alongside women my whole career. If anything, I would say, in a slightly sexist way, I would disproportionately trust more what one of my female colleagues had to say, especially one of the senior ones, because of just how much elbow and genius they'd had to have had and all of the challenges to get where they were, right? And so to that extent, I suppose it's a subconscious bias in favor of women in my professional life, wherever I would seek advice, certainly. But something happened on Strictly where I was in the car with another contestant, and I'm not going to say who, but I had this moment where I realized every single day I was going to do the dancing, and I'd put on a pair of pajama bottoms, and people would go, oh, aren't you great? I could say I want to win. And they were like, oh, clapping me along, etc. And I looked like, well, put it this way, the gay that style forgot. Nobody commented on my clothes. I was just gifted the chance to have a great old time. I'm with somebody else, a woman incredibly bright, having exactly the same experience, allegedly. She's being asked questions about her personal life, whether she's shagging the dancer, the response on social media. And it was a real moment of epiphany. And by now I'm a grown-up, right? Brought up by a single mom. I've posted activist things about anti-Semitism, the same thing that women activists have posted. They're met with rape allegations every single day. News anchors, not just comment on what they're wearing, right? But again, everyday attacks of personal violence against them and their families for having the temerity to have a political point of view. Women who are treated and valued totally differently by virtue of not just, like I say, what they're wearing, but let's say they decide to divorce somebody, he gets the decent narrative because, especially if it's a good-looking person, why would she want anything more than him? Mm-hmm. It doesn't matter. You don't need to look beyond the surface. And I definitely think, and it's interesting now as what's happened at the weekend, for us to kind of think as men, I think, and really honestly reflect on that. I just a really silly example. I wore the same suit every single day for 3 years. No, let me put that again. I wore the same suit on every interview I ever did, every time. I said to one of the loose women, do the same thing. Just wear the same outfit twice. It was, I can't remember who it was. Nadia Sawala, maybe. Anyway, she did. And there was like a flood of Twitter response, assuming that she was having some sort of breakdown.
Wow.
yeah, I mean, you can look it up, and it's not as shallow as outfits. It's just different.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's not about going around going, I'm a feminist or anything of that kind. It's just about kind of thinking about the way in which, and I know it to be true, that our responses to stuff and women's lived experiences are different, both in the political arena, in the private space, and how they're experiencing the world is different. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm not a politician, so people's responses to that is one thing, but just being aware and mindful of it matters. It's an important starting point. And I think the interview, I think what's happened over the weekend and various other things is a good opportunity for us to reflect on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you mentioned Strictly. I mean, did you have the time of your life on Strictly? Were you someone that's always interested in dancing? It looked like a lot of fun.
Yeah. I mean, what's not to like? I was bloody loving it. No, the first week I absolutely crapped myself. In fact, I was thinking about it the other day. I jumped off the stage and in panic, I can't remember any of it. I was just, it was like a sort of, I've never had that before. That sort of emotional, my mouth went dry. And then I did get nervous throughout it. But I mean, again, I was having this right old time. You know, I'd come from dealing with difficult things, you know.
Yeah. I'd
been at that time looking through pages and pages of extremely difficult evidence of years of historic abuse, and dealing with a case in Croydon where I was so deeply unhappy and such a challenging issue. And all of a sudden, I mean, people say, they put the camera for, and how does it feel to go out in front of 13 million people? Well, did anyone die? Excellent. I mean, it was a right line. But then part of the reason I was able to do that was because nobody was also at the same time tweeting or writing about whether I was about my private life, or saying I look like a backward, not that I was even bothered personally myself, but evaluating me about whether or not I secretly wanted to get banged by my dance punch. Of course, would have been something given it was a woman, but you understand.
Yes.
Right? I was gifted the chance to have the best time.
Mm-hmm.
And it was amazing.
Yeah, no, absolutely looks it. Yeah, I mean,
free dancing lessons.
Yeah, and you had a bit of a performing background, like when you were a kid as well, didn't you? Was it the National Youth Theatre that you did some work as a kid?
I did actually. No, I took acting fairly seriously. I did National Youth Theatre when I was 14, and it was sort of okay. And I sort of did a play. In fact, I did Chiwetel Ejiofor, who was Julius Caesar, and I gave it up really. I didn't have a great time there. And then it's not a people could think it's like a school, like Fame or something. It's just like a summer thing that you do. Yeah. But I was fairly talented, but not talented. But you know, I think my answer is I'm not that clever or talented. I'm quite good at putting my goods in the shop window. It's not the same thing, and I know the difference. And I went back to university and I went to university, and it's a true story. I mean, it's not exactly as linear as this, but I mean, I auditioned for a part. I was quite good, but then I saw this other bloke audition and read the same part. I mean, that's what it sounds like, and it was like a moment, and that was Benedict Cumberbatch. And I've told that story before, and it's true. It's like, yeah, okay. Yeah. So I stopped acting after that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, just to finish off, I mean, my mum is a massive fan of yourself, and she did want me to ask you this. Woman. Well, I promised I'd ask you this. I'm not sure she totally believes I'm talking to you, to be honest, but she wants me to ask you what it was like. I mean, you mentioned Greg Rutherford as well, like being woken up by Michael McIntyre at 1 o'clock in the morning.
I'm looking at a picture of it now, in fact, which they did me a painting. Well, I mean, obviously they had to get permission vaguely that they were going to break in, otherwise it would be a crime. So I sort of knew vaguely they were coming, but I didn't know where. And in fact, I'd had to do some pretty difficult work that night, unrelated to the media, and I wasn't going to sleep very well. So I had this great big tumbler of scotch. So what you didn't see was him trying to make me up for about 5 minutes. And I've got terrible eyesight, so I was like, oh, what's my Auntie Adele doing in my bedroom? And then when I realized what was going on, it was great. I mean, except when Sweep started water
It's just
pistoling me.
sooty and sweep there, yeah.
Right. At that point, of course, they cut out all of the swearing. But the best bit was when I met Zamo Maguire from...
Yes,
how old are you?
I'm 31.
So you're too young.
Yeah, but I'm watching the video. I mean, you're very excited to see this guy.
I was talking to someone about this weekend. I'm never impressed, or I'm not excited by people who are like famous now. And over the years, for a variety, you know, sort of A-list, whatever, Clooney. I've met tons of people, you know, people and in a variety of walks of life. And it's not that I don't go out of my way to be unimpressed. It's just once you've met an actor, after the initial flush of recognition, there's so little to say. You know, it's fine, all right, great. Are you an interesting human being? You know, I'm not that sort of bland level, that surface level of fame, however shiny and famous it is not something that I feel excited by. But I grew up in a house with no books, but telly was everything. So the people who were famous when I was a kid, even now, are just the coolest thing ever. And Grange Hill was the cultural and, I suppose, almost the emotional epicenter of my childhood. And Zamo Maguire was the coolest thing ever. And I remember most things I read, you know. So it's a bit like when I first met Andy Peters. Just overjoyed. But then when Zamo came in, Lee McDonald, the poor guy, I start quoting his life back to him. I don't know if you heard,
I heard. Michael
McIntyre says the first time that the first time that somebody has broken into their own stalker's house. That must have been what it felt like for him.
Yeah, you got telling him his date of birth and everything, weren't you? Yeah.
I know, and his star sign. And then this was when he did that job, I mean, you could feel, I mean, the poor love, his face reminded me of the first time I did my driving test, where the guy went, the examiner went peritonitis grey and asked whether I was trying to kill us both. I failed the test, of course, by that point.
Well, Rob, it's been a privilege to talk to you this morning. I mean, are we going to see you in the courtroom again soon? I mean, what's sort of in the pipeline?
There's a number of things. I am going to go to America soon. We're going to hopefully make a bit of Judge Rinder out there. Let's see how that goes.
Oh, great.
My main thing is at the moment, obviously I write, and I hope people read my columns. You can find them online. Most of the work that I'm making moving forward, there's a bit of entertainment. In fact, I'm speaking to you. I'm doing this musicals show.
Okay, great.
Yeah, it's on Sunday. You'll have to let me know what you think. Okay. But again, I just wanted to get out the house. You know what I mean? And I was like, I'll do whatever, frankly. But most of the work I want to make moving forward, for any of your listeners that watch my Holocaust documentaries, is really goes back to what we were talking about before, trying to find ways of being able to hear human stories from a full range of backgrounds, getting out of the way of them, so that we get the gift and the chance of hearing how people feel. And so consequently, being able to think more about why, rather than engaging and shouting at each other through however many characters on Twitter, being able to think, or being conscripted, if you like, to think more deeply about experiences beyond our own, by allowing people to tell their stories and having the courage and the humanity to hear them. Yeah, that's what I want to make more work.
Yeah, about. Amazing. Well, I can't wait to be watching them. And yeah,
well, thanks, Lo.
All the best, Rob. And
have a joyous day. Sorry I was late.
No, that's absolutely fine.
Okay.